Chapter 11. A Trip Through Wonderland. You may well believe that, with such variegated loveliness all about us, we did not linger in the hotel a moment longer than was necessary, but made a hasty tea and sallied forth to explore the neighbourhood. First of all, Betty must pick some fuchsias, so we went back to the road and climbed over a wall into a field, surrounded by high hedges of the gorgeous flower. It was a new experience for Betty to reach up overhead and break off great branches which were simply masses of scarlet bells, until she had her arms full, and I suspect she went a little wobbly over it. But she was to have the same experience many times thereafter, for the fuchsia grows in great profusion throughout southern and western Ireland. I saw but one variety, however, the flower of which has a dark blue trumpet and scarlet bell. But this is perhaps the most showy of all, and nothing could be more gorgeous than a hedge in full bloom. In the woods, or in gardens where they are left untrimmed, the bushes will grow into veritable trees, 25 or 30 feet high. We went back to the hotel when Betty had gathered all she could carry, and she sent the flowers up to our room by a maid who laughed sympathetically. I fancy she had seen such attacks of madness more than once before. And then we started along a winding path which led through the woods down to the shore of the bay. And we soon found that fuchsias were not the only things which grow to giant proportions here, for the path was hedged with ferns 4 or 5 feet high, great lordly fellows, standing stiffly upright as though on parade. Ferns were everywhere, even on the trees overhead, for the trees are padded with moss, and in this the ferns have found a foothold. And there were holly trees still scarlet with last year's berries, and hawthorn fragrant with bloom. And over everything the English ivy ran riot, rather in the same fashion, I thought as I looked at it, in which England herself has run riot over Ireland. We got down to the shore of the bay at last, and I quite agree with Thackeray that it is a world's wonder, with its rock-strewn shore and emerald islands and pellucid water, framed in all about by rugged mountains. We wandered along its edge, gay with sea pinks, for an hour or more, and then spent another hour loitering in the woods, and finally walked on, between the flaming hedges and fern-draped trees, to the little village, which we could smell, long before we came to it, by the tang of peat smoke in the air. It is a mere huddle of low, thatched houses, and I judge that, even amid these gorgeous surroundings, life can be as hard and sordid as anywhere in Ireland. A little distance from the village was a pretty 2-storied villa, covered with roses and climbing vines, and with a large garden beside it, blazing with a great variety of gorgeous bloom. We stopped to look at it over the gate, and the gardener espied us, and came hurrying forward to ask us in to see the flowers. And one of the plants he showed us most proudly was a single, sickly-looking stalk of Indian corn, about a foot high, growing in a pot. When we told him that, in the state we came from, Indian corn filled thousands and thousands of acres every summer, and grew from 8 to 10 feet high, he looked as though he scarcely believed us. But that little stalk of corn brought home to me, as perhaps nothing else could have done, the fact that my own particular corner of the earth is divinely favoured too, in ways unknown even to Glengarriff. I had a most improving conversation that night in the smoking room of the hotel with a Catholic priest and a salesman for the British Petroleum Company. The priest, who must have been at least 65, had the typical long, thin Irish face and was intensely nationalist. The salesman was younger and rather rubicund, and I judged that he was an Englishman and a unionist. It was the priest who did most of the talking about Home Rule after I got him started, and he protested earnestly that Ulster's fears of unfair treatment were utterly unfounded. The Catholics, he said, didn't want supremacy. All they wanted was equality, but they did want that, and felt they were entitled to it. England, he admitted, had made great strides within the past 10 years toward atoning for her old injustice to Ireland, and was evidently trying hard to do what was right. Yes, broke in the salesman, she's going altogether too far. What with old age pensions, and the Purchase Act, and poor relief, and railway building, and putting up labourers' houses and what not. She's spending twice as much on this country as she gets out of it. It won't do. It has got to stop. I don't believe England spends more on Ireland than she gets out of us, said the priest quickly. Here it is in black and white, and the other triumphantly slapped the paper he had been reading. Imperial expenditures for Ireland, 1912-1913. 12,000,000 £381,500. Received from Ireland, £10,850,000. Deficit, £1,531,500. That'll be about $7.5 million, he added for my benefit. Over £1.5 million sterling that England has made Ireland a present of in the past year. What do you think of that? And he turned back to the priest. The figures may be true, said the latter slowly, and then again they may not. I have been told that England burdens Ireland with many expenditures which don't belong to us. But in any event, I agree with you that charity does us no good. It does us harm. We don't want charity. Grunted the salesman sceptically. I'll admit, went on the other, that there are, and always have been, many Irishmen only too eager to take alms. More shame to them. There have always been many ready to sell themselves for a good position under government, and to sell their country too, if need be. We have our share of patriots, but we have more than our share of traitors, I sometimes think. What true Irishmen want is the right to stand alone like men, and fight their own battles. And in fighting them, the North and South will forget their foolish quarrel, and become friends again, as they should be. They aren't half as far apart, even now, as some would have you believe. Most of this talk about Ulster is the black work of men who make their living out of it, who care nothing for Ireland, and take advantage of every little by-election to stir the fire and keep the pot bubbling. I remarked that this ceaseless agitation over elections was unknown in America, where all the elections were held on one day, after which there were no more elections for a year. The priest stared at me in astonishment. Did I understand you say, he asked, that the elections all over your country are held on the same day? Yes, I said, on a day early in November, fixed by law. I don't see how you manage it. It isn't hard to manage. It's really very simple. But where do you get enough police? Enough police? Yes. Here in Ireland, when we have an election, we have to send in the police from all the country round to keep the peace. If we try to have all our elections on one day, there will be riots everywhere. What about? I asked. I don't know. The people wouldn't know themselves, most likely. But as many of them wouldn't welcome the chance for a shindy if the police wasn't there. Isn't it the same in America? I told him I had been an election officer many times, but had never seen any serious disorder at the polls. Aren't there many riots next day? He asked. Why, I said. The day after election is the quietest day in the year. Everybody goes to work as though nothing had happened. I don't think there is much danger of riots, put in the salesman. But we couldn't have your system over here, because with us, a man has a right to vote wherever he owns property and pays taxes, and if all the elections were held on one day, he couldn't get around. Ah yes, nodded the priest. I did not think of that. How do you manage it in America? With us, I explained, every man has one vote, and no more. Again, his eyes goggled. Would you be telling me, he gasped, that your millionaires, your men of vast properties, have no more votes than the poor man? And when I told him that was so, I think he was by way of pitying our millionaires, as men deprived of their just rights, as perhaps, in some respects, they are. And then the salesman told me that he had been to America, as far west as Kansas, where he had visited some friends. He had gone over, he said, with that sort of good-natured contempt for everything American so common in England, but he had come away convinced that there was no country on earth to match it. The only thing I saw to criticise in America were the roads, he added. Why don't you take a leaf from Lloyd George's book? He has put a tax of 3p a gallon on gasoline used by pleasure cars, and this tax goes into a fund for the upkeep of the highways, proportioned according to the number of cars in each county. Gasoline used in commercial cars pays a tax of 3 halfpence a gallon. A great sum is collected in this way, and the upkeep of the highways is thrown upon the people who do them the most damage. If you do the same in America, your roads would soon be as good as ours, and nobody could complain that the tax was unjust. I agreed that it was a clever idea, and I hereby call it to the attention of our lawmakers. Well, said the priest, who had been listening attentively to all of this, I'm glad to know the truth about this tax. I had heard of it, and had thought it another English exaction laid upon Ireland. Now I see that I was wrong, for as you say, it is a just tax. And then he told us some stories of the old days, of famine, and persecution, and eviction, of the hard fight for life on the rocky hillsides, while the fertile valleys were given over to grazing, or ringed with high walls, and turned into game preserves. There were lighter stories too, of the humorous side of Irish character, and one of them, though I suspect it is an old one, I will set down here. The southwest coast of Ireland, of which Bantry Bay forms a part, is one of the most dangerous in the world, because of the rugged capes which stretch far out into the ocean, and the small islands and hidden reefs which lie beyond. It is just the sort of coast where fish abound, and so little villages are scattered all along it, whose menfolks fish whenever the weather lets them, and at other times labour in the tiny potato patches up on the rocky hillsides. Naturally, they are familiar with all the twists and turnings of the coast, and are always on the lookout to add to their scanty incomes by a job of piloting. One day, the crew of a fishing boat perceived a big freighter nosing about in a light fog, rather closer inshore than she should have been, and at once lay alongside and put a man aboard. "Will you be wanting a pilot, sir?" he asked the captain, who was anxiously pacing the bridge. The captain stared a moment at the dirty and tattered visitor. "Who the devil are you?" he demanded at last. "My name's McCarthy, sir. I'm a pilot, sir." "A pilot?" And the captain looked at McCarthy again. "I don't believe it." "'Tis the truth I'm telling you, sir," protested McCarthy. "Well," said the captain, "if it's the truth, you can easily prove it. Let me hear you box the compass." McCarthy was nonplussed. More than once, sitting over a pot of ale in some public house, he had heard old sailors proudly rattle off the points of the compass. But, though he remembered how the rigmarole sounded, he had no idea how to do it, nor even any very clear idea of what it meant. "Faith, I can't do it, sir," he admitted. "Can't do it?" roared the captain. "Can't box the compass? And yet you call yourself a pilot?" McCarthy did some rapid thinking, for he saw a good job, which he could ill afford to lose, slipping through his fingers. "It's like this, sir," he said finally. "In our small place, it's the Irish we'll be using. Never a word of English. And all the English any of us knows is just a little we might pick up from being after the ships. I can't box the compass in English, but I can box it in the Irish, sir, if that will do." The captain looked into the speaker's guileless eyes, and also did some rapid thinking. He knew no Gaelic, but he needed a pilot badly, and he reflected that, in any language, it ought to be possible to tell whether the compass was being boxed correctly, because the words would have to follow each other with a certain similarity of sound, as north, north and by east, north northeast, northeast by north, and so on. "All right," he growled. "Go ahead and let's hear you." "My father," McCarthy began solemnly in his homely Gaelic, "my grandfather, my grandfather's grandmother, my grandmother's grandfather, my great-grandfather, my great-grandfather's grandmother, my great-grandmother's great—" "Hold on," shouted the captain, quite convinced. "I see you know how. Take charge of the ship." And McCarthy thereupon proved he knew how, by getting the vessel safely past Cape Clear. It was pouring rain next morning, a steady, driving rain, which looked as though it might last forever, and we were confronted by the problem which so often confronts the traveller in Ireland: whether to go or stay. To go meant the possibility of having the most beautiful drive in Ireland obscured in mist. To stay meant a dreary day at the hotel, with no assurance that the next day would be any better, or the next, or the next. At last, we decided to go. Never after that was the problem so difficult, for we soon realised the folly of permitting Irish rain to interfere with any plan. In the first place, the rain is not an unmixed evil, for it is soft and fresh and vivifying, and it adds mystery and picturesqueness to the most commonplace landscape. And in the second place, it is very fickle, begins unaccountably, stops unexpectedly, and rarely lasts the day through. In fact, the crest of any ridge may take one into it, or out of it, as we were to find that day. So when, about 10 o'clock, the bus came puffing up to the door, we climbed aboard. The road, for a little way, wound up the valley of the Glengarriff River, and then, striking off into the mountains, climbed upward at a gradient that tested the power of the engine. Almost at once we were in the mountain mist, soft and grey, eddying all about us, whirling aside for an instant now and then to give us tantalising glimpses down into the valleys, and then closing in again. Up and up we went, 1,000 feet and more, and at last we came to the crest of the mountain range which divides County Cork from County Kerry. The road plunges under the crest through a long tunnel, and then winds steeply down into the valley of the Sheen. Again, there was a series of sharp and unprotected turns, just as on the day before, and this time with the added complication of a slippery, sloppy road. But I have never ridden with a more careful or more accomplished driver than we had that day, and he nursed the heavy bus along so quietly, and with such easy mastery, that no one thought of danger. Gradually the mist lightened and cleared away, until we could see the wide valley far below, with the tiny winding river at the bottom, and the walled fields and midget houses. There was a succession of such valleys all the way to Kenmare, and we finally rolled up before the big hotel there, just in time for lunch. We walked down into the village afterwards, and found it more bustling and prosperous than any of the other small villages we had seen. This is due partly perhaps to the tourist traffic, for Kenmare is a famous bathing and fishing resort. But homespun tweeds are manufactured there in considerable quantities, and at the convent scores of girls are employed at lace-making, Celtic embroidery, wood carving and leatherwork. The school is said to be one of the best managed in Ireland, and I was sorry that we did not have time to visit it. We saw, however, some of the Kerry girls in the street, and they were fully handsome enough to give colour to the doggerel. "'Tis sure that the lads will be going to Cork, when their money is gone and they're wanting to work. But 'tis just as sure that they'll turn back to Kerry, for a purty colleen when they're wanting to marry." Kerry is a poor country, and always will be, for it consists mostly of stony hills, and though it is renowned for its scenery, no one except the hotel keepers can live on that. Such little hill farms as have been wrested from the rocks produce but scantily, so when there is a long family, as the Irish put it, and long families are the rule, one son will stay at home to look after the old people, and the others will fare forth into the world to search for a living. I hope it is true that they come back when they're searching for wives, otherwise the lot of the Kerry girls, hard enough under any circumstances, would be harder still. Nowhere in Ireland are there brighter eyes or redder cheeks. The rain was quite over by the time we were ready to start again, and the mist had disappeared under the rays of the sun, so that we had the benefit of the full beauty of the Kenmare River, which is really a wide bay, as we ran close along its western bank. Then the road doubled back from it, and presently the driver stopped at a spot where a narrow footpath struck down into the woods, and advised us to take it, saying that he would wait for us at its other end. In a moment we found ourselves clambering down the side of a wildly beautiful ravine, with a roar of rushing water rising from below, and trees festooned with ferns and ivy meeting above our heads. And then, high above us, we saw the arch of a stone bridge, and quite suddenly we came out upon the stream, the Blackwater, foaming over the rocks. It was at its very best, from the heavy rain of the morning, and we stood there watching it, fascinated by its beauty, as long as we dared. We went on again close beside the shore of the bay, and in half an hour came to Parknasilla, where there is another big hotel, set in the midst of beautiful grounds, and with superb views opening on every side. The climate here is subtropical, and the vegetation mounts to a climax of riotous profusion, with palms and calla lilies growing in the open. The bay too is very fine, with bluff, rock-strewn shores, and innumerable green islets speckling its sparkling waters, and rugged mountains closing in the distance. Then again we were off, mounting steadily, winding under beetling crags, and above grey precipices. Up and up, with the world sinking away into the valley at our left, and the heathery, rock-strewn heights soaring upward at our right. And finally, at our feet opened the wonderful panorama of the brown valley. Brown bog, brown rock, brown heather, mounting to the distant slopes of McGillicuddy's Reeks. We dropped down toward it, mile after mile, then up and up again, to the crest of the ridge beyond. And there, far below us, lay the lakes of Killarney, rimmed with green hills and dotted with green islands, the most sweetly beautiful in all the world. The loveliest general view of the lakes of Killarney to be had from anywhere is as one drops down toward them along the Kenmare Road. Their individual beauties may, of course, be seen to better advantage closer at hand, but from this height, the whole wonderful panorama stretches before one. Right across the valley opens the Gap of Dunloe, with the rugged Reeks at one side, and the green-clad Purple Mountain on the other. Below is the narrow, island-dotted, hill-encircled upper lake. Farther away is Muckross Lake, and far in the distance stretch the blue waters of Loch Lane, the largest of them all. My advice is to take a long look at it, for you will never see anything more lovely. The road soon dropped among the trees, and our driver pointed out with evident pride the Queen's cottage on the shore of the upper lake, built a good many years ago in order that Victoria, on her tour of the lakes, might have a fitting place in which to lunch, and which has never been occupied since. Then the road ran close beside the border of the middle lake, plunged again into the woods for a mile or two, and at last the bus stopped before the inn where we intended to stay, and we climbed down regretfully. The inn was a long, two-storied building, standing a little back from the road, and the porter who came running out to take our bags might have stepped straight out of Pickwick. He was so fat, so jolly, and so rubicund. I had some films I wanted developed at once, because I was afraid the damp weather would affect them, and I asked him where I could get it done. "There's a man just this side of the village can do it, sir," he said. "You will see a sign as you go along the road." "How far is it?" I asked. "The village is 2 miles, sir." "Then it's less than 2 miles?" "It is, sir." I turned to Betty. "We've got plenty of time before dinner," I said. "Suppose we walk in and see the town?" And Betty, wotting little of what was before her, consented. I put my films in my pocket, and we set off eagerly along the pleasant road, past a little village, past a church with a graveyard back of it, and a Celtic cross high on the hillside above it, past a hotel or two, around one turn after another, with green-clad hills mounting steeply to our right, and the blue lake lying low on our left. We met an occasional cyclist, or a donkey cart being driven home from market, or a labourer trudging stolidly home from work, or 2 or 3 girls strolling along with arms interlaced, exchanging confidences. And the air was very sweet, and the evening very cool and pleasant, and the sky full of glorious colour. "We must certainly have come 2 miles, said Betty. "What do you suppose is the matter?" "I don't know," I said, looking at my watch and noting that we had been half an hour on the road. "Perhaps we'll see the town round the next turn." But we didn't. All we saw was about half a mile of empty road. We covered this and came to another turn, and there before us lay another long stretch of road. Determined not to give up, we pushed on, and came to a bridge over a rippling little stream, which we learnt afterward was the Flesk, and we stopped and looked at it a while, and rested. "We must be nearly there," I said encouragingly. "What's bothering me," explained Betty, "isn't the distance we have to go to get there. It's the distance we have to go to get back." There was another bend in the road just beyond the bridge, and we turned this, confident that the village would be there. But it wasn't. We saw nothing but the smooth highway, stretching away and away into the dim distance. I looked at my watch again. "We've been walking nearly an hour," I said. "It looks as though we might miss dinner after all." And, just then, there came the trot of a horse and the jingle of harness along the road behind us, and a sidecar drew up with a flourish. "Would your honour be wanting a car?" asked the jarvey, leaning towards us, ingratiatingly. "We were told there was a photographer's just this side of the village. Do you know where it is?" "I do, your honour." "How far is it?" "'Tis just over there beyond. If you will step up on the car, I'll have you there in a minute. I'm going right past it." Of course we got up, and as the jarvey had said, the photographer's shop was just around the next bend. But, before I got down, I made a bargain with him to drive us back to our hotel, and after I had left my films, we set merrily off through the gathering dusk. "There's one thing I don't understand," I said at last. "The porter at the hotel said it was only 2 miles to the village, yet we walked for an hour without getting there." "He meant Irish miles, your honour," explained the jarvey, laughing. "There is an old saying that an Irish mile is a mile and a bit, and the bit is always as long as the mile. You see, here in old Ireland, we always stretch everything." I have found since that the Irish mile is about 1.25 miles, but this is no real measure of its elasticity. More than once thereafter we saw 1 mile stretch out to 3, and we soon came to realise that the Irish mind is extremely vague and inexact when it comes to distances and directions. We got back to the hotel to have our first view of what proved to be a nightly ceremony. On a stand in the entrance hall was a huge platter, and on the platter lay a huge salmon, and a card leaning against it announced that it weighed 14 pounds and had been caught that day by Captain Gregory, and there were flowers all about it, so it's a proud fish it should have been. There were 5 or 6 other salmon on a lower table, each with the card giving its weight, anywhere from 5 pounds to 11, and the whole collection represented the day's catch of the guests of the hotel. For the hotel, being handy to the lakes, and clean and comfortable and homelike, is a favourite resort of the fishermen who come to Killarney during the salmon season. Every evening while we were there, as the fishermen came in, tired and wet, with their boatmen tramping behind them carrying the fish, if there were any, they were met at the door by the rotund porter, his face beaming like a full moon, a red harvest moon, and the fish would be solemnly weighed, and the biggest would be decorated with flowers and awarded a place of honour, and the others would be grouped around it. And after dinner, the fishermen would stand and look at them, their hands deep in their pockets. And later on there would be a great bustle as the fish were wrapped in straw and tied up, ready to be sent by parcel post to admiring friends back home. It was a cosmopolitan crowd which gathered that evening after dinner, about the big fireplace in the smoking room, where a most welcome and comforting wood fire blazed and crackled. The weather had turned very cold, and Betty and I were dressed as warmly as we had been at any time during the winter, though it was the 5th of June, and the papers were running long columns about the fearful heatwave which had America in its grip. There was a sturdy, red-faced old Scotchman in carpet slippers, and a sallow, heavy-lidded ancient, whom the others addressed as Colonel, and just such a close-lipped, stiff-backed sporting squire as is Canon Hannay's Major Kent, of near Ballymoy. And there were 2 or 3 other Englishmen with no outstanding characteristic, except their insularity. And the talk was of flies and rods and casts, and everybody was indignant at the suffragette who had rushed out on the track and tried to stop the derby. And there was a steady emptying of tall glasses and a steadily deepening cloud of tobacco smoke, and everybody was very comfortable and cosy. And presently the old Scotchman took pity on me as a mere American who knew nothing about the high mysteries of sport. "It must be a great pleasure for you to sit before an open fire like this," he said. "It is," I agreed. "There's nothing more pleasant than a wood fire." "You may well say so, but of course in America you have nothing like it." "Nothing like it," I repeated, looking at him. "Why no," he said. "You never see an open fire in America. All you have is steam pipes running all around the room." I looked at him again to see if he was in earnest, and then I tried gently to disabuse his mind of that idea. But it was no use. Indeed, he got rather huffy when I said I had never seen a room with steam pipes running all around it. The savage insularity of the average Englishman is matter for never-ending amusement, once one has grown accustomed to his contempt. He believes that all American men are money grubbers, and all American women social climbers, who chew gum and talk loudly, while their daughters are forward minxes who call their fathers Popper, and that men, women and children are alike wholly lacking in culture and good taste. The peculiar thing about it is that he never for an instant doubts his own good taste in telling one all this frankly, to one's face. This is no fancy sketch. My own opinion is that the average Englishman has no genuine feeling of friendship for America, and his ignorance of things American is abysmal. One day on the boat coming home, a well-educated Englishman whom I had got to know asked me the name of a man with whom I had been talking. "That is Senator so-and-so," I answered. "What is a senator?" he inquired. I remembered that one day Betty and I and 2 other Americans happened to be driving through the Tyrol in a coach with 2 Englishmen, and they began to discuss American railway accidents, a favourite topic with Englishmen when Americans are present. And one of them remarked that it was no wonder there were so many accidents in America, since when Americans built a railroad, all they did was to lay the ties along on top of the ground and spike the rails to them. I asked him if he had ever been to America, and he said no, and I advised him to run over and pay us a visit sometime. This huffed him. "Ah," he said, "but what you Americans would give for a king." "Give for a king?" "Yes, you would give anything for a king. Then you could have a court and an aristocracy and some real society. You're sick of your limping, halting, make-believe government, and you know it." We all 4 stared at him in astonishment, wondering if he had gone suddenly mad. Then Betty got her breath. "No," she said, "you're really wrong about that. You see, we settled the king question back in 1776. The rest was silence. But really, Englishmen aren't to blame for their distorted ideas of America, for they get those ideas from the English newspapers. And the only kind of American news most English newspapers publish is freak news. During that week, for instance, almost the only American news in any of the papers was about the terrific heatwave, about Harry Thaw's escape from Matterhorn, and about some millionaire who had taken bichloride of mercury by mistake, and lived for 10 days or so afterwards, occupying the time very cheerfully in closing up his affairs. After his death, one of the great London dailies published a column editorial about the affair, reasoning in the most solemn manner that his survival for so long a time could have been due only to the remarkable tonic properties of the American climate. With the Irish, it is entirely different. In the first place, America is to them the haven to which 1 million Irishmen have fled from English persecution. And in the next place, their knowledge of the country comes not from newspapers, but from letters written by relatives and friends. The letters are somewhat rosier, I fear, than the facts warrant, but they establish a kindly feeling which makes every Irishman ready to welcome the passing American as a friend and brother. The only trouble is that he is also apt to regard him as necessarily a millionaire. It is undoubtedly true that a large portion of the lower-class Irish consider it no disgrace to beg from an American. Not that they are habitual beggars, but when an American comes their way, they seem to consider it a waste of opportunity if they do not apply for a small donation. In tourist centres such as Dublin and Killarney, they are very persistent, especially the children, and would follow along for minutes on end, telling the tale of their poverty and distress in queer, bated voices, as though they lacked the strength to speak aloud. But Betty accidentally discovered a cure for this nuisance, quite as effective as John Minogue's, and I take pleasure in passing it on. Like most other people who have lived together for a long time, we have developed a lot of symbols and passwords, without meaning to anyone but ourselves. And it has become a rather foolish habit of mine when we are together, and I see something I especially admire, to express my admiration by uttering the single word, Hickenlooper. And Betty, if she agrees, says Oppenheimer, and we understand each other and pass on. One day in Cork, a group of children were unusually annoying, and followed along until Betty, losing patience, turned upon them sharply, pointed her finger at them, and said, Oppenheimer. I shall never forget the startled look in their eyes as they stopped dead in their tracks, stared at her for an instant, and then fled helter-skelter. We decided afterwards that they thought she was putting a curse on them. She tried it more than once thereafter, and it never failed to work. So, if you are annoyed beyond endurance by juvenile beggars in Ireland, turn upon them sharply, point your finger at them, and say, Oppenheimer. And since I am giving advice, I will give one bit more before I close this chapter. Among the purchases which Betty had made in New York just before we sailed was a small electric torch. I had derided it as unnecessary, but she had insisted on bringing it along, and had put it in our travelling bag when we were sorting over our luggage in Dublin. The first night at Thurles, in a dreary little room, with only the flickering candle for a light, I acknowledged her wisdom, for the bright glow of the torch was very welcome. Again at Glengariff, candles were the only illumination. And that night at Killarney, when I got to our room, I found her in animated conversation with the chambermaid by the light of a single tallow dip. They were talking about America, I think, and the maid's eyes were shining with excitement, and her cheeks were flushed, and the beautiful soft brogue was rolling off her tongue, when a sudden gust from the open window blew the candle out. Betty picked up the torch from the dresser and pressed the button. Glory be to God, what's that? Cried the girl, as the glare flashed into her astonished eyes. It's only a torch, said Betty. It won't hurt you. And then, when I had lighted the candle again, she showed the girl how it worked. Glory be to God, she cried again. The wonder of it. You'd never be getting that in Ireland. No, I got it in New York. Ah, 'tis a wonderful place, said the girl reverentially. No place but America will be having such things as that. Now this is no doubt a libel upon Ireland, for I suppose one can get electric torches there. At any rate, my advice is to get one somewhere, a good one, and take it along in your handbag. This advice is good for the continent as well as for Ireland, but it is especially good for the latter, and the reason is this. In the old days, when English prodigals wasted their substance on castellated palaces, the Irish squire, being a wiser man, spent his money on good wine and good horses. Or, when he had no money, ran light-heartedly into debt for them. As to his family mansion, he contented himself with adding a wing from time to time, as it might be needed, either because of the increasing number of his children, or the widening circle of his friends. The result was a singular house, often only 1 story high, never more than 2, flung wide over a great deal of ground, and of a most irregular plan. Such a house had many advantages, for, as another writer has pointed out, at one end of it the ladies could sleep undisturbed, no matter how joyous the men were at the other. There were no stairs to fall down, and the long narrow corridors were pleasant to those who found it hard to direct their devious steps. But the time came when these hospitable Irishmen found themselves overwhelmed by debt. Their houses were taken from them, and many of them, since they were too large for any private family, were converted into inns. The traveller in rural Ireland will encounter more than one of them, and will find those long, shadowy, zigzag corridors eerie places after night, unless he has a torch to light his steps. The doors are not always fitted with locks, and if the window is kept open, an intruder has only to step over the sill. We never had any intruder, but had we had, I am sure one flash from the torch would have sent him flying.